Imagine a force so powerful it can move mountains, yet so fragile it can disappear in a decade.
The Colorado River was more of a curse than a blessing.
That is the story of the Colorado River. For millions of years, it ran wild. Then we put a collar on it.
We're looking back at efforts to tame the river in order to limit the impact of devastating floods.
We built a wall 1,600 feet wide to stop the flow. But nature has a way of fighting back. When scientists finally decided to let the beast loose again, they expected a simple flood. What they got was a terrifying display of power that turned the river red, threatened to tear the dam apart, and exposed a crisis no one saw coming. The flood that shook the earth. On a crisp morning in March 1996, a group of engineers and scientists gathered at the base of a massive concrete wall in northern Arizona. They were about to do something that had never been done in the history of the United States. They were going to intentionally flood the Grand Canyon. For decades, the Glen Canyon Dam had held the mighty Colorado River in a chokehold, turning a wild, raging beast into a tame, cold stream. But on this day, they were going to let the beast loose. At exactly 6:20 in the morning, the order was given. The operator pressed a button, and deep inside the concrete belly of the dam, massive steel gates began to slide open. The sound was the first thing to hit them. It was a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the soles of their boots and rattled the windows of the observation decks. Then came the water. 4 giant jet tubes, which had sat silent for years, suddenly erupted. A jet of white, frothing water shot out into the riverbed below. It looked less like a river and more like an explosion. Within minutes, the flow ramped up. We are talking about water moving at a speed and volume that is hard to even wrap your head around. Basically, the plan was to release nearly 335,000 gallons of water every single second. To put that into perspective, imagine filling an Olympic-sized swimming pool in the blink of an eye. Now imagine doing that every 2 seconds, for days on end. That is the kind of power we are dealing with. As the 8 hydroelectric turbines spun up to full capacity and the 4 bypass tubes screamed wide open, the river level began to rise. It surged upward, climbing 16 feet higher than the day before. The dry, cracked banks of the river, which had not seen moisture in years, were suddenly swallowed whole. Boulders the size of small cars, which had been sitting stagnant in the channel, began to tumble and roll under the crushing weight of the current. The noise was deafening. It was the sound of a river reclaiming its territory. But here is the catch. This was not just about watching water flow. This was a desperate medical procedure for a dying patient. The patient was the Grand Canyon, and the disease was a lack of sand. You see, for millions of years, the Colorado River was like a conveyor belt. It did not just carry water, it carried millions of tons of sediment, silt, and sand from the Rocky Mountains all the way to the ocean. This sand was the lifeblood of the canyon. It built massive beaches, created habitats for fish, and protected the archaeological history of the region. But when the dam was sealed in 1963, that conveyor belt stopped. The water could get through, but the sand got trapped behind the wall. So the water that came out of the dam was clear, cold, and hungry. Because it had no sand in it, it actually stripped the beaches away, eating the riverbanks like a parasite. The engineers hoped that by flooding the river with this massive surge, they could stir up the sand that was sleeping on the bottom of the riverbed and push it up onto the banks. They wanted to rebuild the beaches overnight. As the floodwaters raged for 7 days, the visual transformation was shocking. The river turned from a clear emerald green to a churning chocolate brown soup. This was a good sign. It meant the water was picking up dirt. Scientists were stationed all along the river, camping on the cliffs, watching their instruments nervously. They were measuring the sediment load, hoping that the math they had done in their labs would hold up in the real world. And for a moment, it seemed like a miracle. New beaches appeared out of nowhere. Sandbars that had vanished 10 years ago suddenly rose from the depths. The canyon looked wild again. It looked like it did before humans decided to tame it. But the celebration was short-lived. The sheer violence of the water did move the sand, but it did not keep it there. The crazy part is that while the engineers were high-fiving each other, the river was already undoing their work. The physics of the canyon are relentless. As soon as the floodgates closed and the water level dropped back to normal, the new sandbars began to collapse. They were too steep, too unstable. The river, now returning to its clear, hungry state, began to eat them alive again. It was a harsh lesson in the power of nature versus the arrogance of engineering. But the 1996 flood was just the beginning. It was the first time we admitted that the dam had broken something fundamental in the ecosystem. It opened the door to a series of experiments that continue to this day. But every time they open those tubes, they are playing with fire. The pressure on the dam during these releases is immense. The vibration can be felt miles away. And there is always that lingering fear in the back of everyone's mind. What if the gates don't close? This fear is not unfounded. Years prior, during an emergency release, the water had actually turned red. Not from mud, but from the sandstone bedrock of the dam's own tunnels being ripped apart by the force of the water. We will get to that terrified moment later, but you have to understand that every time they flood the valley, they are pushing the machinery to its absolute limit. The water rushing through the Grand Canyon during these artificial floods is a reminder of what we have lost. It is a ghost of the river that used to be. And while the tourists on the rim might just see a pretty view, down at the bottom, a war is being fought. It is a war between the concrete wall we built and the geological forces that want to tear it down. The flood of '96 proved that we can mimic nature, but we can never truly replace it. The river is a living thing, and we put it in a straitjacket. Now, every few years, we loosen the straps just for a few days to let it breathe, and then we tighten them again. But the river remembers. And as the water recedes, it leaves behind something that scientists are struggling to explain. Changes in the fish, changes in the plants, and changes in the very shape of the canyon that should not be happening. The experiment showed us that you cannot simply turn a river on and off like a kitchen faucet without consequences. The valley was flooded dry for millions of years. Metaphorically speaking, it was dry of its natural sediment. And when we tried to fix it, we realized we might have made the problem more complex. The sandbars are just the tip of the iceberg. What lies beneath the water and what is buried in those disappearing banks is a history that is being erased faster than we can record it. The flood was supposed to save the canyon, but it might have just accelerated its transformation into something completely alien. The water is rising, the dam is shaking, and the clock is ticking. The invisible erosion crisis. What most people don't realize is that a river is not just water moving downhill. It is a complex machine, a living engine that supports everything around it. When we talk about the Colorado River, we are talking about the American Nile. For 6 million years, this river did whatever it wanted. It raged in the spring, trickled in the autumn, and carried enough dirt to build entire deltas. But the most important thing it carried was sand. Sand sounds boring, right? It is just tiny rocks. But in the Grand Canyon, sand is everything. It is the foundation of life. Before the dam, the river was warm and muddy. It looked like a cup of hot chocolate. This mud was crucial. It created massive beaches where animals could nest. It created backwaters, quiet little pools behind the sandbars where native fish could hide and grow. But here is the catch. When the Glen Canyon Dam was finished in 1963, it acted like a giant filter. The water stopped moving fast enough to carry the sand. All that sediment, millions of tons of it every year, sank to the bottom of Lake Powell behind the dam. The water that came out the other side was crystal clear. It looks beautiful in photos, sure. Tourists love the blue-green color. But ecologically, it is a disaster. Without the sand, the beaches started to disappear. The river, now hungry for sediment, scoured the bottom of the channel, stripping away the remaining sand and sending it downstream to Lake Mead. It was cannibalizing its own bed, and this is where the silent death begins. It is not an explosion, it is a slow, agonizing wasting away. The first casualties were the native fish. Fish like the humpback chub, which had evolved for millions of years to live in warm, muddy water. Suddenly, they were swimming in cold, clear water. They had nowhere to hide because the backwaters were gone. Their babies were eaten by predators that could now see them perfectly in the clear water. The chub population crashed. It was a massacre that happened underwater where no one could see it. But the damage went further than just fish. The sandbars were also the camping grounds for the river runners. In the early days, you could pull a raft over anywhere and sleep on a massive sandy beach. Now those beaches are shrinking. They are being replaced by rocky slopes and thick, thorny vegetation. The camping spots are disappearing, making the river harder to navigate and harder to enjoy. And get this, the loss of sand is actually erasing history. The Grand Canyon is home to thousands of archaeological sites. We are talking about the history of the persistent people, the ancestors of the Hopi, the Zuni, and the Navajo. There are granaries tucked into the cliffs, ancient roasting pits for agave, and petroglyphs carved into the rocks. For centuries, these sites were protected by the sand. The wind would blow the river sand up the cliffs, burying the sites and keeping them safe from the elements. It was a natural blanket. But now, with the sand trapped behind the dam, there is no new sand to blow up. The wind is blowing, but it is empty. So the old sand is blowing away, uncovering these ancient structures. Once they are exposed to the rain and the sun, they begin to crumble. Walls that stood for 1,000 years are falling apart in decades. It is a cultural genocide caused by a dam. We are losing the record of human history in the canyon because we wanted electricity and a reservoir. The tribes who view this canyon as sacred, the Havasupai, the Hulapai, the Southern Paiute, have been watching this happen with heartbreak. To them, the river is not a resource. It is a living being, and it is being starved. The dam cut off its food supply. The river is skinny, weak, and unrecognizable to the elders who remember it before the concrete wall went up. Scientists call this the sediment deficit. It is a polite way of saying we broke the ecosystem. The experiments in 1996 and 2004 were attempts to fix this. They thought, hey, if we flood it, the sand will come back. And it did for a little bit. But because the dam still blocks the new sand coming from the mountains, we are just recycling the same old dirt. It is like trying to make a sandwich with the crumbs left on the plate. Eventually, you run out of crumbs. The vegetation is another huge problem. You might think plants are good, right? Green is good, but not here. Invasive species like the tamarisk tree have taken over. These trees are aggressive. They drink massive amounts of water and excrete salt into the soil, killing other plants. They form dense thickets that you cannot walk through. Before the dam, the massive spring floods would rip these plants out by their roots, cleaning the banks. It was nature's way of gardening. But now, with the flow controlled and steady, the invasive plants are winning. They are locking the banks in place, turning the dynamic, shifting river into a static, overgrown canal. This is why the valley feels flooded dry. It has water, but it is dry of the natural processes that made it a canyon. It is a zombie ecosystem. It looks alive, but the internal organs are failing. The complex web of life that depended on the mud, the floods, and the warm water has been shattered, and that is putting it lightly. The changes are happening so fast that evolution cannot keep up. We are seeing a collapse of the food web. The bugs are changing, the birds are changing, and the mammals are changing. The river is becoming a hostile environment for the things that are supposed to live there. So when engineers open the tubes to create an artificial flood, they are not just trying to move sand. They are trying to shock the heart of a dying patient. They are trying to remind the river of what it used to be. But is it enough? Can a few days of high water make up for 360 days of artificial drought? The sand is the clock. Every grain that washes down to Lake Mead is a second loss that we cannot get back. And right now, the hourglass is running empty. The canyon is becoming a museum of what used to be rather than a living wilderness. But if you think the sand is the only problem, you are missing the bigger picture. The dam itself is sitting on a knife's edge, and there was one day in 1983 when we almost lost it all. Blowing the dam. Wide open. To understand why they flood the valley, you have to understand the monster that makes it necessary. The Glen Canyon Dam is a marvel of engineering, but it is also a terrifying trap. It holds back Lake Powell, the second largest reservoir in the United States. That is 26 million acre-feet of water. If that dam were to fail, a wall of water hundreds of feet high would scour the Grand Canyon down to the bedrock, wiping out everything in its path all the way to Mexico. It's not that simple, though. The dam wasn't just built for water, it was built for power. It is a cash cow. The 8 turbines inside produce electricity for 5 million people in 6 states. It generates over $100 million a year in revenue. This is why the decision to open the bypass tubes is so controversial. Every drop of water that bypasses the turbines is money thrown down the drain. When they ran the experiment in 1996, they were literally pouring money into the river. The power companies hated it. They argued that the lost revenue would drive up electricity bills for grandmothers in Phoenix and hospitals in Salt Lake City. This is the central conflict. Do we save the ecosystem, or do we keep the lights on cheaply? But there is a darker history here. The dam was built with a flaw. In 1983, a massive snowmelt in the Rockies sent way more water down the river than anyone expected. Lake Powell filled up faster than they could drain it. The water was lapping at the very top of the dam. If it went over the top, it could erode the foundation and cause a catastrophic failure. So, the engineers had to open the spillways. These are giant tunnels drilled through the red sandstone rock around the dam. They are like emergency slides for water. They opened them up and a torrent of water rushed through. But then the ground started to shake. A terrible rumbling sound came from the tunnels. When they looked at the water coming out at the bottom, they froze. The water was red, bright, blood red. It wasn't mud, it was the sandstone of the canyon walls. The water was moving so fast that it was creating a phenomenon called cavitation. Basically, vacuum bubbles were forming in the water and imploding with the force of dynamite. These implosions were tearing chunks of concrete and rock out of the tunnel walls. The tunnel was eating itself. They had to shut it down or the water would have eroded a hole right around the dam, potentially causing the dam to collapse. They barely survived that event. It was a wake-up call. It showed that our control over this river is an illusion. We think we have tamed it, but the physics of water are always waiting for a mistake. This is why the artificial floods today are so calculated. They are terrified of breaking the machine again. They only release enough water to move some sand, but never enough to risk the spillways. It is a compromise that satisfies no one. The environmentalists say it is not enough water to save the canyon. The power companies say it is too much water wasted. And get this, the dam is also losing its primary function. It was built to store water for dry years. But we have been in a dry year for 2 decades now. The water level in Lake Powell has dropped to historic lows. There are boat ramps that now end in cliffs hundreds of feet above the water. The bathtub ring, the white stain of minerals on the canyon walls, shows us where the water used to be. As the water level drops, the pressure changes. The turbines need a certain amount of water pressure, or head, to spin efficiently. If the water gets too low, the turbines stop. This is called dead pool. If we hit dead pool, the water stops flowing through the dam entirely. The Grand Canyon would dry up, leaving only a tiny trickle from leakage. So the artificial floods are becoming harder to justify. How can you release extra water to build beaches when you might not have enough water to drink next year? It is a cruel irony. We built the dam to ensure water security, but we use so much water that we are now insecure. The 1922 Compact, the law that divided the river's water, was based on a lie. They measured the river during a wet period and assumed it would always be that high. They promised more water to the states than the river actually has. We have been operating on a deficit for 100 years and the bill is finally coming due. Basically, the Glen Canyon Dam is a credit card and we have maxed it out. Now the bank is calling. The artificial floods are like making a minimum payment on a massive debt. It keeps the system running for another month, but it doesn't solve the problem. The engineers who operate the dam are smart people. They know the math. They look at the charts and see the lines going down. They know that unless the climate changes dramatically, which it won't, the dam is becoming obsolete. But the structure itself remains a marvel. Standing on top of it, looking down 700 feet at the tiny raft floating below, you feel the weight of human ambition. We blocked a continent's drainage system. We flooded a valley that was beautiful beyond words, Glen Canyon, to save another valley downstream. But in doing so, we might have doomed both. The something that formed in the title isn't just a physical thing, it is a situation. A paradox where we have to destroy the river to save it and drain the reservoir to fill the canyon. It is an engineering nightmare loop, and beneath the surface of that cold, clear water, biological monsters are breeding. Things that were never meant to be in the Arizona desert are now the kings of the river. The false paradise below the rim. If you raft down the Grand Canyon today, you will see something that looks lush and beautiful. There is a thick green ribbon of trees lining the banks. It looks like a paradise. But ask any biologist, and they will tell you it is a lie. That green wall should not exist. In a natural river, the annual floods would rip those plants out. The banks would be open sand and rock. But because we stopped the floods, the vegetation has gone crazy. It is a dense jungle of willow, tamarisk, and arrowweed. This might sound nice, but it is terrible for the ecosystem. It blocks the sun, it changes the insect population, and it locks the banks in place, preventing the river from moving naturally. But the strangest thing is happening underwater. Remember the cold, clear water I mentioned? Well, it turns out that trout love it. Rainbow trout and brown trout are not native to the Grand Canyon. They belong in mountain streams. But because the dam releases cold water from the bottom of the reservoir, the Colorado River has turned into a massive trout farm. This is great for fishermen. People travel from all over the world to fly fish at Lee's Ferry, just below the dam. It is a world-class fishery. But for the native fish, it is the apocalypse. The trout are predators. They eat the eggs and the young of the native fish like the humpback chub and the razorback sucker. So, here is the deal. The National Park Service is actually at war with the trout. They have spent millions of dollars trying to kill the trout in certain parts of the river to save the native fish. They use electro-fishing boats to shock the water, stun the trout, and remove them. It is a bizarre situation. We created an environment that is perfect for the alien fish, and now we have to actively murder them to keep the real fish alive. It gets weirder. The clear water allows sunlight to penetrate deep into the river. This has caused an explosion of algae. Cladophora, a type of green algae, grows on the rocks. It looks like green hair. This algae supports a specific type of bug called the amphipod or scud. The trout eat the scuds. It is a completely new food chain that formed in just 40 years. This new ecosystem is fake. It is entirely dependent on the dam. If we remove the dam tomorrow, the warm, muddy water would return, the trout would die, the algae would die, and the green wall would be washed away. The native fish would probably celebrate, if fish could celebrate. But we cannot remove the dam. So we are stuck managing this Frankenstein ecosystem. The artificial floods are part of this management. By flooding the river, we try to disrupt the life cycle of the aquatic bugs and the trout, giving the native fish a fighting chance. Everyone's obsessed with the idea of restoring the river, but we can't restore it. We can only manage it. We have created a novel ecosystem, a scientific term for something that we made by accident and now have to live with. The green wall also stops the wind from moving sand. As I mentioned before, the sand needs to blow up the cliffs to cover the ancient ruins, but the dense bushes catch the sand and hold it on the beach. So even when we do manage to get sand on the banks, it gets stuck there. It doesn't do its job. Then there is the issue of the temperature. The water comes out of the dam at about 46 degrees Fahrenheit. It is freezing. If you fall in, hypothermia sets in quickly. Native fish need water that is 60 or 70 degrees to reproduce. So the water is literally a contraceptive for them. Scientists have proposed adding a temperature control device to the dam, basically a giant mixing valve that would take warm water from the top of the lake and mix it with the cold water. But it would cost millions and no one wants to pay for it. So are we looking at the end of the Colorado River as we know it? We built a marvel to tame the wild, but we might have just killed it slowly instead. Is it time to tear down the dam and let nature take over, or is that the end for the West? Hit that like button if you learned something and subscribe for more deep dives. See you in the next one.